Liz Isaacs. And Howard, Liz, and I are with Housing Innovations. We've had the pleasure of getting to know, I think, most of you throughout the course of our many years supporting the Connecticut Balance of State Continuum of Care. And those that we haven't had the opportunity to meet yet, hello, nice to meet you on Zoom. Thanks everyone for joining us this morning. We are going to be talking about the fiscal requirements in the Continuum of Care program, and it's the first of two sessions that Howard, Liz, and I are going to be doing with you all. The second session is going to be next week, and that's going to be Tuesday the 13th, same time, same place. So it's the same link in Zoom that we used today, and it's also going to be from 10 to 11:30. And we will be covering different content in that session than we're covering today. So we hope that you can join us again next week. So as you probably heard, Liz started our recording, and that webinar will be recorded and posted to the CT Boss website. The slides will also be posted to the CT Boss website, and if she hasn't already, Liz will get the slides also into the chat in just a moment so you can pull them down from there. We absolutely encourage everyone. We'd love to see your smiling faces, and it's good for you guys to also be able to see each other. So we encourage everyone to turn their cameras on, though we certainly understand if that is not going to work for you today. We also really like these sessions to be interactive. So please, please, please make comments, ask questions. We're very informal, so you don't have to wait for us to break for to prompt to see if anyone has questions. Just speak up, unmute yourself. You can raise your hand in Zoom, or you can pop questions into the chat. Liz is going to help us monitor what's going on to the chat. As I said, we're scheduled to end at 11:30, and we promise to get you out of here on time. And I think we'll be able to hopefully answer all of the questions, as well as get through the content that we have scheduled for this morning. But if we don't get to your question, again, we'll be here again next week, so you can ask it then. And our team is always available to answer questions, and our contact information is one of the last slides in the deck. So please feel free at any time, always, to ask our team whatever questions you have about the Continuum of Care program. So we will try. I know a lot of you have been around this block with us many times before. We're also always trying to be mindful that there may be some folks who are very new to the Continuum of Care program. And so Howard and I will try hard not to use acronyms, but if we say anything that you don't understand, please stop us and we will explain. You'll hear us say a lot of times CT Boss and COC, and those things stand for the Connecticut Balance of State Continuum of Care. And the Continuum of Care. So our agenda for this morning, if I can get Zoom to cooperate, there we go. So this is our agenda for today. It would be great. We love to be able to see who's on with us this morning, and we've got about 45 people with us, so we're not going to have time for everybody to unmute and introduce yourselves, but if you want to put your name, your agency, what your role at your agency is, and how many years you've been involved in the Continuum of Care program. That helps Howard and I to know who's with us this morning, and it also helps you all to know who among your colleagues is on this morning as well. So the first topic we'll talk about is the matching requirement in the COC program. Then we'll talk about program income. We'll go quickly through the federal cost principles, and then we will talk today about the rental assistance budget line item and what's eligible under that budget line item, under the leasing budget line item, under operating, and under supportive services. And then next week, here's what our agenda will be. So next week, we'll talk about ineligible costs, about HUD requirements for how you document staff time that you're billing to your COC contract. Howard will talk to us about project administration costs and indirect costs, which can be very confusing, how it works in the COC program, and always good to hear Howard explain those two different concepts. We'll talk about the audit requirements. We'll talk about making sure that your grants are fully expended but not overexpended. We'll talk about ELOCs, which is HUD's electronic system for how you draw down your funds. We'll talk about the restrictions HUD has on compensation and gifts, on the internal control requirements, and about what could potentially happen if you don't follow all of these HUD rules that we're going to be talking about. So we're going to start off by talking about match. So most of you probably know that the COC program does have a 25% match requirement, and that requirement extends to all of your budget line items with the exception of leasing. You do not have to match leasing dollars in the COC program. You can meet that match requirement through either cash or in-kind donations of goods or services, or a combination of the two. So for example, if you've got a $100,000 grant, 25% would be $25,000, and you could meet that match requirement with $20,000 in cash and $5,000 in kind, just as an example. So during your grant term, so your grant has an operating start date and an operating end date, and during that grant term, you've got to demonstrate that you have received all of the cash match that you committed in your application, and that you have expended those funds on eligible expenses. So in other words, your books for your program, your general ledger, have got to show that that money, that cash came onto your books, and that money was expended on costs that are defined by HUD in the COC program interim rule as eligible costs. Finally, it used to be back in the day, for those of you who've been around a very long time, you may remember this, where people were claiming benefits, so Social Security or Saga Cash, that were paid by government agencies directly to program participants. There was a time when that was being claimed as cash match, and HUD clarified many years ago now that that is not allowable, and that you cannot claim such benefits as cash match, because those benefits do not come onto the books for your agency, right? They're paid directly from that agency, Social Security Administration, to your program participants, and therefore do not qualify. Sorry. My slides will not advance. There we go. All right. So match, in addition to being cash match, you can also meet your match requirement through an in-kind donation, for example, of goods or services, right? So examples of that could be, you might have a board member who's going to teach some kind of class, like a GED class, to your program participants and not charge you or them anything, right? You might, so that would be an example of a donated service, right? You might have a partner organization in your local CAN that provides mental health services to participants at no cost, right? Or you might have space that you lease from a church at significantly below market value, right? Those are all examples of things that you could count as in-kind match. And as with cash match, that good or service that's being contributed has to be an eligible COC activity, right? So I said you could have food donated for participants because that's an eligible COC cost, but you could not have food donated for staff meetings, for example, because that's an ineligible COC cost. So in-kind match requires, unlike cash match, requires that you have an MOU between you as the grant recipient and the third party that is providing that in-kind match. And that MOU has to meet certain requirements. So for example, in the example that we just talked about, right, where you've got a board member who's teaching a GED class, you would need to execute a written agreement with that board member that indicates what she's going to provide, right, that she's going to provide it during the operating year, that it's going to be provided to eligible COC participants. You've got to include how you valued what that contribution is worth, right? How that calculation was done, and that it was valued at the same rate that she gets paid to teach the class in other settings. Plus, when you're working with in-kind match, and this is always important to keep in mind, you've also got to be able to document that the class was actually delivered, right? So you have to have the MOU up front, and then at the back end, you have to have documentation that you actually received that in-kind contribution. So with the example of the GED class, that might be, for example, a sign-in sheet, right? That for everybody that participated, if it was a live class, or a webinar recording, right? If it was an Zoom-based or similar kind of class. So we always say, and those of you who've been to these trainings before have heard Howard and I say this many times before, the documentation requirements for in-kind match are a lot more onerous than cash match. So we always encourage you to use cash match whenever possible. If you claim in-kind match in your application, it's likely someone on our team is going to reach out to you and say, hey, are you sure you don't want to use cash match? Because again, the documentation requirements are more onerous and harder to meet. So a little bit about those documentation requirements. You can also value, as I said, you can also use donated goods, right, for in-kind match, right? So you might have a local grocery store that's going to donate food for your participants, right? Or a local hardware store that's going to donate materials that you're going to use to maintain your units. In those examples, you're going to need to have that commitment up front, right? So before HUD will execute your grant agreement, you've got to have, a letter, for example, from that donor saying what they're going to donate. It should be on their letterhead. It's got to be signed and dated. It's got to say that the donation is going to happen during the operating year. Again, it's got to say that the value of those donated goods is consistent with what would ordinarily be paid for similar goods in your local market. It's got to have the date on which you're going to receive that donation, approximate date. It's got to be within the, as I said, the operating year. And again, it has to be for an allowable activity, right? So they can't donate something that would not be an eligible ECOC expense. So this slide says, this should say in-kind match, not cash match, sorry. So basically, if you're going to have, in terms of the MOU that we talked about before, you also want to make sure that that MOU indicates that there are no conditions, right, on the donation that they're making of the in-kind service, and that it's got to describe the specific service or good that's going to be provided during the grant term. And if it's a service rather than a good, it's got to state the profession of the person providing the service, right? So the person is a licensed clinical social worker, for example. All right. So if you do not meet the match requirement, right? So HUD comes out to monitor, and you can't demonstrate to them that you actually received that cash or you actually received that good or service during the grant operating year. HUD will require you to pay back the funds that were not matched. So we don't want that to happen. And then again, many of you have heard Howard and I say this before. HUD will monitor based upon the full match amount that you committed in your application, right? So there is never any advantage and there is only risk to committing more than the 25% cash match. So just make sure that your application commits exactly 25%. Don't commit any more, because if you commit more, you're going to have to document that you got more, and there's no advantage to doing that. For folks that are on this morning that are from a DEMIS PSH project, you all don't have to worry about the cash match commitment, because DEMIS provides so many mental health services to participants they actually document that and are able to produce that documentation. So they actually make the commitment up front, as well as are able to produce the documentation that that match was actually met, should HUD come out and monitor one of those projects. So this, you don't have to worry about this, but all of our other programs do need to provide, unless the only thing that you have is a leasing budget line item, and I don't think we have any programs in that category. All right, so program income. So program income is basically money that's generated by your project. And most often this is going to be rent that's paid by tenants to you as the COC grant recipient or subrecipient in a building that you own or are master leasing. So this happens in leasing projects, it happens in project-based rental assistance projects, and it happens in sponsor-based rental assistance projects. Another common example of program income that we see in CT BOSS is if you're paying security deposits using COC funds and you require that those security deposits be returned to you rather than to the program participant, that is an example of program income. So typically our tenant-based rental assistance projects are not going to have any program income or much program income. They might have a little bit of return security deposits. So this happens most commonly in our congregate projects. It's similar to match program income in that you've got to be able to demonstrate to HUD that the money that came into the program that was generated by the project was expended during that operating year on things that are eligible under the COC program interim rule. And then finally, the last bullet on this slide, a little bit of good news for you. You can use program income as part of your cash match. So for example, if you've got a congregate building that you own, tenants are paying rent to you, you can include that tenant rent in your cash match. So I think we are going to do a poll, and Liz is going to launch it for us. All right, so these are our poll questions. What can't be used as cash match? And you can pick more than one answer here. Your options are proceeds from the grantee's annual gala used to support the agency programs, resident income gained by program case managers using SOAR, substance use treatment services provided to program participants through an MOU with a treatment provider, and the cost of rent for the supportive service office that is donated by a member of the organization's board of directors.
We did the 35 as well, right? Oh.
So we'll give you a couple more minutes here. All right, I think we've got more than half of folks participating. Liz, I think let's end the poll and share the results. All right, so 78% of you got this question right. So even though we allowed multiple answers here, there was in fact only one right answer. So sorry, that was a little tricky. So the correct answer here is resident income. Remember, benefits, right, are not an eligible source of cash match because those are paid directly to the participant and do not come on the books of your agencies. So you certainly can use proceeds that you raise privately through a gala or other things, as long as you expend those resources on eligible activities. That's an eligible source of match. Substance use treatment services provided by a partner in the community with that required MOU is also an eligible use of match. And rent for your supportive services office is it also an eligible cost? And if you've got somebody who's donating space to you, that is also an eligible use of match. All right. So our next slide here. So it's important for you guys to understand what costs are eligible and can be billed to HUD and what costs aren't eligible. If HUD determines when they come out and monitor you that you expended COC funds on something that is ineligible, they are going to recapture the funds, which basically means they're going to ask your agency to pay back that money to them. There's a difference between accidentally spending on something that's ineligible and intentionally committing fraud, right? So if you expend money on, say, immigration legal services, which is not an eligible type of legal services in the COC program, HUD's going to ask you to pay that money back. If you use the money to take your team on a trip to Vegas, right? You may actually go to jail because that is a fraudulent use of the money, and there may be legal consequences associated with that. So you can only bill HUD for costs that are specifically defined in the COC program interim rule as eligible. So just because the rule doesn't mention the cost doesn't mean it's eligible, right? If the cost isn't mentioned in the COC program interim rule, then in fact it is an ineligible cost. And then in addition, the cost has to be delineated in what you submitted to HUD in eSnaps in your project application and your technical submission, and it has to be approved by HUD. So for example, even though case management is an eligible COC expense, right? If your project doesn't have a supportive services budget line item, then you cannot expend COC funds on case management. And then finally, in order to be eligible, the cost has to be documented. So for example, for case management, right, you are probably documenting that through case notes or something similar. All right. So we're going to go quickly through these 4 federal cost principles. So all of the costs that you bill to HUD have got to be reasonable, allocable, consistently treated, and allowable. So to be reasonable, the amount that you pay for that cost has to be consistent with what a prudent person would pay in similar circumstances. For example, if that board member that we talked about before charged $50,000 for that one GED class, right? HUD's likely to say that's not reasonable. So the cost has to be allocable to your COC grant. So for example, if you bought computers, right, for a different program, right, for your shelter program, and you use COC funds to do that, right, that's not allowable. It's not allocable to your COC grant because it's being used in a different program. And then your costs have to be consistently treated. Howard's going to talk about the difference between direct and indirect costs next week. But basically, you have to classify costs as either direct or indirect, and you cannot treat the same costs as both direct and indirect. And then finally, the cost has got to be allowable. So there are certain kinds of costs that are never going to be allowable under a federal award, and we're also going to go through that next week. And then additionally, to be allowable, the costs have to be specifically defined, as we've been saying, in the COC program interim rule. All right. So I think most of this we went through already. As part of the annual COC program competition, you have to submit, of course, a project application every year. And that application includes a project budget. HUD's going to review that project application and budget, and they may ask you to make changes in eSnaps during the technical submission process. Once that budget is approved, it becomes part of your grant agreement, and you can only spend COC funds on those approved budget line items. So for example, if what's in eSnaps, you only have a rental assistance and a project admin budget line item, right? You can't expend COC funds on case management because that's a social services cost, and you do not have such a budget line item in your budget, even though it's an eligible cost under the COC program interim rule. So if you want to amend your project budget and spend money on COC program eligible costs other than those that are in your approved budget, or you want to shift more than 10% of the funds from one approved budget line item to another budget line item, that requires that you get a grant agreement amendment executed by HUD. You cannot do that until you have such an executed grant agreement amendment. So before I pass it on to Howard, do we have any questions about the things that we've covered so far? Oh, Liz, thank you. Guys, I'm sorry. I said that we're going to be on for 90 minutes today. We're not going to be on for 90 minutes today. We're going to be on for an hour today. So my bad. Thank you, Liz, for pointing out that. We're scheduled to end today at 11, not at 11:30. My bad. Any other questions in the chat? I don't see any. There's a lot of people introducing themselves. Thank you, everybody. All right, I'm going to pass it over to Howard.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Good morning. I'm going to take it home. May I have the next slide, please? They're pesky little things, these slides this morning. Okay. Here we go. This is this word that I really do not like.
Howard not with us?
Are you not hearing me now? Am I not?
I can hear you.
Okay.
Howard, you're muted, I think.
No,
I don't think
you're not muted. We can't hear you, Howard.
I can hear him.
I think Lauren no longer can hear me, but she knows this information. Everybody else can, the rest of you folks hear me? Yeah. Okay, then I'll keep talking. What I was saying is, this is a real word I hate to pronounce. So I'm glad you couldn't hear me say it. The principle of cost allocability. Really, it's a short word, but it's a tough one. So in order to be able to allocate a cost to a specific HUD contract, number one, of course, it's as Lauren has indicated. I mean, if your cost, if that is not in your budget, it doesn't matter whether it's eligible or not. You can't spend funds on it unless it's budgeted into your grant. Obviously, it's got to be linked to the eligible activities funded in the grant. Same thing. If you have a supportive services budget line and you're billing for case management, perfect. You've got that budget line. Case management is an allowable activity. It's in your budget. You're perfect in doing it. Reasonable. I mean, as we said, and Lauren indicated that before, anything that you do when you're expending federal funds, you really need to document that it is a reasonable expenditure of funds. When we are talking about rental assistance or leasing, stuff like that, among the reasons why HUD requires that you do this rent reasonableness determination is because of this federal cost principle. It's got to be reasonable in order for it to be an allowable cost. The only way we can document whether all those rental charges are reasonable or not is by examining what comparable units are costing in your individual market. And then finally, as Lauren has said many, many times, you've got to be able to document those costs as well. So now going back to diving a little deeper into what does it mean that something is reasonable. So it's got to be ordinary and necessary for the operation of the project. Again, let's say we've got case management, you've got a supportive services budget line, you're paying for case managers. Your case managers, in order to do their work, need some kind of a laptop, some kind of a personal computer. They can't enter into data into HMIS or look at participant notes or anything like that without the benefit of a computer. Therefore, it is clearly ordinary and necessary for the doing that case management function to have a computer. Cost is in accordance with market prices. Well, listen, if you're going to buy that laptop computer for your case managers, what you want to do is make sure that you're basically, going to Amazon, going to Best Buy, looking to what a comparable computer that's got similar specifications is going to cost, and taking consideration those things, making sure that you're paying the best price for that product. What you don't do is, if your brother-in-law has a pizza shop and computer sales thing, you don't go to your brother-in-law shop and pay $6,000 for a personal computer that you can buy for $500 from Amazon. You really want to make sure that you're using you're buying the most reasonable thing. Again, this is the acting with prudence. The concept is, if it was your own money, would you be spending it in this way? If it's my money, I ain't going to buy it from Joe and Son's Pizza. I'm going to buy it from a reputable computer supplier that's going to give me the best price on that product. And again, every one of your organization should have some written policies and procedures for procuring, for purchasing any of these things. It should say that you should look at 3 different prices. Whatever it says is in your written policies for procuring things is what you are supposed to follow when you're doing this procurement. And you should have a written procurement policy that specifies these small things as well as larger purchases. Next slide, please. Procurement. So as I said, you do want these written procurement policies. Then if they're written, you're going to follow them. And you know, we're talking about the federal government. The federal government talks of expenditures far larger than any of our personal budgets are like. The federal government considers small purchases to be below $150,000. Personally, I'm sure none of us consider that to be a small purchase benchmark. But that means that basically when virtually every transaction that you're doing with COC grant funds, they're going to be small purchases. So again, you don't need to do a whole competitive bidding or anything like that. You just want to show that you've made some effort to make sure that the goods or the services that you're purchasing are the best value for the government and for your contractor and for your contract. And of course, you want to select the most reasonable offer. And as much as possible, you want to use things like purchase orders because they really specify exactly what it is, the specifications of that which you are procuring for your organization. Next slide, please. Okay, here comes another poll for us. So Liz, if you could fire up. And folks, it's another opportunity to participate. And here we go. This is one of those two, I think it's maybe just 2 and 3, 2 and 1. So cost eligibility. Can projects expend COC funds on expenses that are eligible under the COC program internal rule, but not delineated in the approved project budget? That is a yes or no question. Can you spend bucks on expenses that are eligible but not in the budget? The second one is, if the COC interim rule does not specify that an expense is ineligible, can you assume that it is eligible? So if the rules don't say it's ineligible, can you therefore safely assume that it is eligible? And then there is a third question. I think I have to scroll at least to see it. And the third question is, what risk does the project face if they charge an eligible expense? 1, HUD will require you to attend a week-long training session. Well, that sounds awful. There are no risks, or HUD may issue a monitoring finding and recapture funds. Okay, how are we doing here? We'll give you all another moment or two to answer these 3 questions. And let's give just another moment. Anybody else want to jump in this pool? A couple more people jumping in. Okay, let's end it here and let's see what we got. So the first question was overwhelmingly 87% of you got this one correct. No, you can't expend COC funds that are eligible if they are not in your program budget. You know, you've got to make sure, as Lauren indicated, if they're not in your original application budget, you can go to the HUD field office to seek to amend that budget to get it included in your budget. But if it's not in the original or the amended budget, you can spend HUD dollars on it without question. If it does not specify that an expense is ineligible, can you assume it's eligible? The way they very clearly, specifically wrote these rules, anything that is not specifically identified in the regulations is not eligible. You've got to be able to go into the regulations and see very specifically that which you're paying these HUD dollars for is identified in the regs. If you can't see it in the regs, you can't spend your money on that item. And then the last question, we had a couple of things in here. What risks? Oh, everybody, 100% correct. Perfect. Of course, HUD is not going to require you to attend a week-long training session. That really sounds like I think you should take the prison option before you do that one. And of course, there are risks if you spend funds on ineligible categories. So HUD may issue a monitoring funding. And in certain circumstances, and we've seen it happen more than once, HUD actually does require you to wire transfer funds back to the federal treasury. And I can assure you, no nonprofit likes to take funds out of their banking account and wire transfer them back into the federal treasury. So we do not want to do that. Okay. End of that poll. Next slide, please. Okay, talking about the eligible expenses under rental assistance. And remember, rental assistance is how we cover tenant-based rental assistance, sponsor-based, and project-based. So you can pay up to 100% of the rent. Remember, under rental assistance, participants are required to pay rent. So if your participants have income, they're expected to pay a percentage of their income under rental assistance toward that rent. But if they have zero income, then you can pay for 100% of the rent in rental assistance. You can pay for up to 2 months worth of security deposits. The state of Connecticut actually has legislation that says that if people are seniors over the age of 62, they can only be charged 1 month security deposit. So that is, although the federal regulations would allow you to pay for 2 months, state of Connecticut has local legislation that prohibits the charging of security deposits greater than 1 month for senior citizens. So be careful that you don't inadvertently violate that rule, that law. You can also, upon initial occupancy in that first check that you make to the landlord, cover both the first month's rent, which is what they're going to look for to let somebody move in, but you can also pay the last month's rent. So if it's a 12-month contract that you're signing, you can pay both the first month and month 12 rent in that first payment that you make to the landlord. You also, under rental assistance, can pay damages. The damages can't exceed 1 month's rent, so that's not all that much, number one. And number two, you can't make that payment to the landlord until the time at which your participant has left the unit. So if you've still got a participant occupying the unit, you cannot make those damages payments to the landlord. They have to leave the unit. And then finally, the cost of administering the rental assistance. We talked about the rent reasonableness determination. You need to do these housing quality inspections. That's going to change in the not too distant future, but to another system. But you've got to make sure that the units pass the HUD's quality standards as they are then in effect. You need to calculate the subsidy to make sure that that you're paying the program is paying the appropriate share of the rent. And I said that rent reasonableness as well. There is a requirement under rental assistance, under any of these housing programs, to do some version of an environmental review. HUD, for whatever reason, determines that all environmental reviews are not billed under either rental assistance or leasing. Environmental reviews are billed under the administrative cost budget line. So be careful about that one. You can only pay for those under admin costs. Next slide, please. I think we're going to talk about leasing. And we are. So under leasing, now under rental assistance, the thing we last talked about, the maximum that you can pay in rental assistance is the reasonable rent. So if you have a situation and you're paying rental assistance and you do a rent reasonableness determination and your reasonable rent is above the fair market rent, you can pay up to the reasonable rent in rental assistance. Not so in leasing. In leasing, the maximum amount of grant funds that you can pay are the fair market rent. That is an absolute ceiling on HUD funding that you can spend on leasing. However, if the reasonable rent is below the fair market rent, this doesn't happen often, but can occur, and it's why you need to do a rent reasonableness determination under leasing. If the reasonable rent is lower than the fair market rent, then the maximum amount that you can pay is the reasonable rent. Again, that's going back to those earlier cost principles. You can't pay more than is reasonable. You've done a determination that this is the reasonable cost for rent in this market. Therefore, that limits how much you can pay under this program. In leasing, you've got different ways in which you may be able to cover the cost of utilities than you can in rental assistance. Same thing in rental assistance, by the way. If electricity and gas and water are included in the rent, you can use your rental assistance or your leasing payments to pay for them. Unlike rental assistance, only in leasing, you can also pay for utilities under the operating cost budget line. And under the rental assistance, you're limited in terms of how much utility you can pay for utilities. You're limited by the utility allowance from your local PHA, your local housing authority. Under leasing, if you're paying them under operating costs, you do not have that same cap. You can actually pay the actual utilities as an operating cost expense on the operations budget line, not under the leasing budget line. You can pay security deposits, the same thing. You can pay up to 2 months worth of security deposits, but of course in Connecticut, you can't do that for senior citizens. You can't pay for that. Remember, I told you about that 1 month's worth of damages. You can't use leasing funds to pay for that damages. That's a big difference here. And you can pay for the last month's rent and first month's rent under leasing as you could under rental assistance. Next slide, please. Okay, so here are the operating cost line. I referred to it. Whoops, we'll go back up a little. Under operating costs, these are, first of all, you can combine operating costs with leasing. You cannot combine in a structure or unit operating costs with rental assistance. So if you're using rental assistance, you cannot pay for any of these expenses under the operating cost budget line. You can't have an operating cost budget line working in those units. So, but If it is leasing, you could do it, or if it's also just funded under operations. Sometimes a single site project is just funded under operations. You can pay for the maintenance and repair. Note that there is a special limitation. If you're paying for security, at least 50% of the units in the structure must be funded with COC funds in order to pay for buildings security. These are electricity, gas, water, and sewer. These are delineated as the utility costs because these are the only eligible utility costs, but those are eligible utility costs. You can pay for up to 100% of these utilities. Furniture is a biggie, and a lot of times our people do not have any furniture when they come into a unit. Again, unfortunately, under rental assistance, you cannot pay for the furniture, but if you're using leasing or operating cost lines to subsidize the units, you can pay for the furniture and any equipment that you need under the operation cost lines. And of course, if you got staff associated with maintaining and cleaning your structure, their direct salaries and their benefits and other overhead expenses can all be charged to the operating cost budget line. Next slide, please. Okay, supportive services. So here you see a long list of services. I really encourage you, probably at least on an annual basis, is to take a look at the regulations under supportive services. There are a lot of details there, and it's like what we said before. If HUD details under supportive services, and it's going to detail under each of these what you're allowed to spend funds on, you want to make sure that what you're spending funds on are specifically listed in these multiple eligible cost items under supportive services. Some examples of things that you want to be careful of, like moving is an eligible expense, but it's a one-time only expense. So you want to be careful about that. Childcare is an eligible expense, but the children need to be under 13 years of age unless they're disabled, in which case they can be up to 18 years of age. And childcare has got to be provided by a licensed provider in your jurisdiction. So you need to meet those requirements in order to pay for childcare, for example. Housing search, that's another housing search and counseling. Rental application fees, these days, I don't know why, I think rental application fees are really kind of blossoming, and we'll find a lot of participants who, have to pay multiple rental application fees. You can pay for that under housing search and counseling, and paying for that can really help your participants because some of those fees are pretty high and very, very difficult for people with very, very limited incomes to pay. Legal services are allowed, but subject to restrictions. You cannot pay for any legal services that have to do with immigration. You can't pay for any legal services that have to do with home ownership or mortgage costs. And finally, you can't pay for legal services if you got any kind of a flat retainer basis with an attorney. You cannot pay for it on that basis. And, we see that transportation, that is an eligible cost as well, but that's limited too. I mean, you can pay for client transportation going to work, going to medical appointments, going to access other supportive services, taking their kids to and from childcare. But basically, those are the limitations on what you can pay for their transportation. You can't pay for every transportation need of your participants, just the ones that are delineated in the regulations. If you're paying for participant transportation, pay attention to what the regulations say to be careful that you're not subsidizing costs that you're not allowed to subsidize. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is, by the way, if you are, and many times you're going to go back up if you could. Many times you're going to be providing you're going to have a separate office space where you're providing your supportive service. Your case managers are going to work out of a separate office location. Your residents are all on tenant-based rental assistance, so they're all out in the community. You've got an office space where your case managers are housed. So therefore, you can pay for all the expenses of that office facility associated with your case managers, maintaining it, maintaining security, making sure that they have furniture and equipment to do their work on. Obviously, your staff doesn't want to sit on the floor, and you want to give them a computer to be able to work on, and the costs of the utilities in that office space. Yep. Okay. And then so things that HUD through both AAQs and other things have made clear that are not eligible as supportive services. HUD says, by the way, we're not going to pay to train your staff to be able to do the job that they're doing. That staff, if you're hiring somebody as a case manager, they should have the skills and experience necessary to perform the function of case manager. So they're not going to pay for their costs of getting that training in order to provide case management. However, they do understand that HUD has a lot of very confusing rules. So this kind of training where we're telling you specifically how you can use HUD things, that is an eligible COC expense in terms of training on COC requirements, but training people to do their specific job, getting licenses, certifications, and things like that is unfortunately something that is not paid for under COC funds. HUD made it clear that unfortunately gift cards, with the exception of using it as a way to pay for people with lived experience to assist us on working on COC. We can use gift cards to help those folks, but we can't use gift cards to help our regular participants in order to buy groceries and things like that. It's really unfortunate that we can't do that, but basically gift cards are considered to be a cash equivalent, and they're easily sellable for maybe less than their dollar amount, but you really cannot give cash to participants because once you're giving them cash, you really don't have control on as to how that's going to be spent, and therefore it might not be spent in, along with program requirements. So you can't use gift cards. I already mentioned under legal services, the regulations specifically say you can't pay for legal assistance that deals with immigration issues. Now this one is a little confusing. Actually, you can pay for car repairs, but there's limitations on it. In order to pay, and which is it's a nice benefit, because sometimes if you're in rural areas or not even suburban areas where there's really insufficient public transportation and our folks need to go to work and a vehicle is the only way they can go to work. If public transportation is insufficient in their areas, you can use COC funds under the transportation line to pay for repairs to their vehicle to allow them to continue to be employed. However, there is this limitation. You got to look up online. It's easy to do these days. Look up the Kelley Blue Book value of the vehicle. Make sure that if you're paying for repairs, it's not worth more than 10% of the Kelley Blue Book value of the vehicle. But sometimes using that can really keep people employed and be of great benefit to them and your program. Okay. Next slide, please. So paying for furniture, again, if it's talking about beds, dressers, things like that, kitchen tables and stuff like that, you can pay for it under participant units under the operating cost budget line, which means that if your project is funded under operations costs or leasing, you can pay for it that way. If it's funded under rental assistance, unfortunately, you can't pay for furniture using COC funds. I know that is a hassle. Fortunately, we know there are a lot of community resources that allow folks to get low cost or free furniture donated to them. And if we're using rental assistance, those are the resources that we have to use. If we're using leasing or operations, we can actually pay for the furniture. And then finally, furniture for staff offices, as we said, that is an eligible cost under the sort of what it's called the operating costs under the supportive services budget line. And then paying for household supplies, it's really challenging. It would be nice if we had a nice, clean and obvious way, because a lot of people do not have these supplies. If you do not have essential cleaning supplies, other essential stuff, it's really difficult to keep your apartment in good order. However, basically, you sort of have to sandwich things like those basic kitchenwares, linens, and cleaning supplies. Basically, we can sometimes sandwich them in by saying that it is life skills training. We're training them on how to maintain the unit. If they don't have any cleaning supplies, if they don't got a mop, they don't got a broom, they don't have a vacuum cleaner, it's really hard to show people how to effectively maintain the unit. So under the guise of equipping people to having sufficient life skills to maintain the units, we can also purchase the necessary gear and equipment that will allow them to do it. And then there are also under outreach, it allows you to address some urgent physical needs such as blankets and toiletries. So if you do have folks that really do not have any access to things like, those basic essential cleaning and just personal care items, you can generally address those as under urgent physical needs, and they would be billable as a supportive service, and it's allowable under outreach, which does include those urgent physical needs items. Next slide, please. And office supplies. So basically, generally speaking, if it's done by case managers, any support staff under the supportive services budget line, then you can pay for them under the supportive services budget line, just as charge it to the costs of doing that supportive services budget line. If you've got other expenses that you cannot readily assigned to an eligible activity, these are the reasons why there is this thing, the allowance for indirect costs. As Lauren had indicated, we're going to spend time talking about indirect costs in our session next week. We're going to go into great detail on that, so I won't go any further on it. But if you do have some of those incidentals, which it's not really clear how you sandwich them into any budget line, we're going to talk about how you can use the indirect costs as a way to cover those expenses during our next week's session. Next slide, please. Okay, we have got yet another poll for you. And if Liz could launch this one away, we will see. So what type of expense is this? Okay, what type of expense is the staff salary for conducting housing quality inspections? Is that billable to rental assistance or leasing, supportive services, project administrative expenses, or is it an eligible expense? The next question in this series is, what type of expense is benefits for a case management supervisor? And again, what line will you bill that to? Rental assistance or leasing, supportive services, project administration, or is it ineligible? And then we've got a third one here. Let me scroll down and find that one. Okay, what type of expense is a staff salary and what type of expense is staff salary and travel cost to attend motivational interview training? Rental assistance, supportive services, project admin, or is this an ineligible expense? We'll give you a few more moments to complete this. Take your time. Let a few more folks do it. I know we should have some sort of musical or something like that to keep it a little more entertaining while we're waiting for these. I mean, and also change the pace of it so there's a little excitement towards the end of it to make sure that everybody gets in before the music ends. Do it like a musical chairs thing. Okay, I will stop babbling. I think we've gone on for a while, so I think we could end. Oh, we're stopping this. Oh, wait. Okay. So what type of expense is this first one? All right. Well, this was, I guess, was a tricky question for folks. So as we said before, when you're doing housing quality inspections, it is billable under either the rental assistance or the leasing budget line, depending on how your project is funded. It is not billed to these other categories. You do bill it under that one budget line, rental assistance or leasing. You can bill staff time to it. That's a good thing because this is a budget line that you can often accrue some dollars in because of the tenant rental contribution. And so being able to bill some other expenses to this line is a good thing because we want to fully expend funds. So you do really want to build that expense for the inspections to the rental assistance or the leasing budget line. What type of expense is benefits for case management supervisor? This one, if it's the case management supervisor, that case management is an eligible expense under the supportive services budget line. Supervision is an eligible activity for case management. So this is an expense that you would bill towards the supportive services budget line. The majority of you, 54% of you, got that one correct. If it is anything that related to benefits or the direct provision of services or the supervision of it, it all gets billed to the supportive services budget line. This last question was a little tricky, but 2/3 of you got it correctly. What type of expense is staff salary and training cost to attend a motivational interview training? Unfortunately, as we said before, the only training that HUD wants to pay for is training on HUD stuff. Although motivational interviewing is an extremely important technique for your case managers in working with your residents, sometimes for your program administration staff and working with your staff. It's a great skill. We encourage all staff working in this program to have it, but HUD does not pay for that. That's considered to be what staff coming into the program is a skill that folks should have. So that one, the correct answer is it is an ineligible expense under the regulations for this program. Okay, I think so. That, as we are just a few moments away from the 11 o'clock hour, that's our presentation this morning. As Lauren indicated, we are going to be here same time, same place, same people, talking a little more about fiscal stuff, the great indirect stuff. We got a couple of minutes to, if anybody has any questions you want to unmute and throw at us, we're happy to take what you got.
I'm a new employee for
We did have a question about the slides. So the slides are posted to the CT Boss website. It's www.ctbos.org. And you just go to the trainings page. There's also maybe you can pop that link again in the chat, Liz, so that people can get directly to the slides from the chat as well.
I think I was hearing a question.
Yeah, Howard, this is Carlos Samperi. I work for CRT. I'm brand new. So I have a question about how you can be 10% off your budget, right?
Okay. Where the 10% comes in is 10% has to do with changes that you can make to your budget without getting HUD approval. So you can make what is called a minor grant amendment to your budget. You can move up to 10% of the sending line. So if you want, say you've got a rental assistance budget that has got $100,000 of it, you can take up to 10% of that line and move it to another budget category. You do not need HUD permission to do that. You must inform HUD that you're doing it. The reasons why you must inform them is HUD has got to change the ELOC system to take that $10,000 away from the rental assistance line and put it where you said it would go. If HUD doesn't make that change, you can't draw down those dollars. So you need to notify HUD that you've made that change. You can up to 10% of the line that you're taking funds from can be moved to another line category. You don't need permission. You do need to notify HUD that you have done that.
That's very helpful. The other question is how detailed are you about lines? Do you have, if you have a category like salaries, right? Salaries and fringes, are you concerned about the total salaries and fringes or a specific line item like health insurance within salaries and fringes? Do you look at a line as a category or do you look at specific lines as accounts or account numbers?
Yeah, I mean, again, for personnel stuff, I mean, you just, again, as Lauren indicated, you want to make sure that any personnel charged is documented by some timesheets, and therefore we're only billing for the time that they've actually spent working on the project. But then once you have documented that, basically it would be, both their direct salary and then whatever fringe benefits are associated with, and that's going to be based on your organizational policy. And HUD has no, if your organization says these are the fringe benefits, HUD will reimburse you up to whatever your organizational policies are on that, based on the actual time spent by the staff on the program.
Okay, I was interested to know whether totality, right? Like you have salaries and benefits will be $10,000.
Yep.
Line item by line item, do you care about that or just the total?
Well, again, most of your salaries items are going to come under the supportive services line. There'll be some under admin, and as we indicated, if you are charging for those housing quality inspections, there'll be some billed under the rental assistance or leasing line. So again, it's just again, it would be every one of those. The time everyone would be fully loaded would be called fully loaded. So whatever hours that you're charging to the rental assistance, because the HQS would be their salary plus all their benefits, as we have got documentation that they spent that time doing the HQS.
I think what you're saying is that is considered 10% within the categories that you define, right? So it doesn't necessarily has to be 10% by line item.
I think the confusion might be how HUD defines a budget line item versus how in your project budget you have a budget. So when we say 10%, we mean 10% on the HUD defined budget line items, which are only leasing, operating, rental assistance,
Yes.
supportive services, admin, HMIS. That's it. Those are the HUD budget line items. So it's not on whatever your internal agency is doing on your budget line items. It's 10% on the HUD defined budget line items as defined in the budget that you submitted in eSnaps.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Great. If I see that we're like a minute over, if there are there more questions in the chat?
There's one question that
Okay.
Oh, it says
the
that
10% can be moved anytime during the performance period, correct?
I'm nodding. Although, I mean, if it's too late in the year, it's going to be hard to make that work. So
All right, we want to be respectful of everyone's time, and we certainly appreciate you being with us. And as I said, if you've got questions and we weren't able to get to them, bring them next week or email us. And here is the slide with our contact
Great.
information. So thank you all, and we look forward to seeing you
We
next
do.
week.
Bye-bye,
Take
everybody.
care.